Welcome to the Mountain Takes. I'm Isaac. There is a moment on every mountain where a climber realizes the mountain doesn't care about their story, about their followers, about their achievement, about why they came. Today, we're looking at what that moment feels like through the eyes of people who didn't survive it. What happened next changed everything. It was April 28, 2024, Everest's Khumbu icefall. 19,800 feet, temperature minus 12 degrees Fahrenheit, the seracs cracking somewhere in the dark like distant gunfire. Deborah Ashworth was 54 years old, a hedge fund executive from Greenwich, Connecticut, used to getting exactly what she paid for. She'd spent close to $200,000 on this expedition, and she reminded her guides of that number constantly, as if the price tag itself could rewrite the rules of altitude. Her flaw wasn't physical weakness. It was the unshakable belief that money could negotiate with a mountain that had never once cared about anyone's bank balance. The first warning sign came at Camp 1, when her guide, a Sherpa named Pemba Sherpa, told her the acclimatization schedule required 2 extra rest days before pushing higher. She refused outright, calling the delay unacceptable and demanding the itinerary be compressed to fit her travel plans. Pemba warned her that rushing the rotation would sharply increase her risk of altitude sickness. She told him she hadn't hired him for his opinions, only for his hands. Before we go further, I want you to sit with something. Somewhere on this mountain right now, someone is making the exact same mistake Deborah made, and they don't know it yet. If you've ever wondered whether wealth actually protects people from consequences, drop your answer in the comments, because what happens next might change your mind completely. And if stories like this keep you up thinking, subscribing costs nothing and helps more than you'd guess. The second warning sign appeared at Camp 2, 21,300 feet, when the expedition doctor recorded her oxygen saturation at 71%, dangerously low even for that elevation, and recommended a full day of rest. Deborah instead accused the doctor of exaggerating the numbers just to justify a slower, cheaper pace, and threatened a scathing public review of the entire outfitter. The third warning sign came at the yellow band below Camp 3, when a ladder crossing a crevasse had shifted overnight in the wind. Pemba asked for 20 minutes to re-anchor it safely before anyone crossed. Deborah screamed at him in front of the entire team, calling him incompetent and demanding he move faster. Witnesses later said her voice carried across the ice for nearly a full minute, and that even climbers from other expeditions stopped to stare. The inciting incident happened at 6:14 in the morning on May 16th, above the South Col, when Deborah refused her guide's direct order to turn back, despite a headache that had progressed into slurred, disjointed speech. She insisted the symptoms were simple exhaustion, not sickness, and pushed past the balcony at 27,600 feet without her supplemental oxygen flowing properly. Her regulator left loosened after an earlier argument over gear weight. Here's a question worth asking before this story finishes. How many warning signs does a person need before pride stops mattering more than survival? Everest has answered that question hundreds of times, and almost every answer ends the same way. Comment below with what you think finally breaks that kind of stubbornness, if anything ever does. And if you want to see exactly how this unravels, stay through the end, because the next 2 minutes explain everything. By 9:40 that morning, her coordination had deteriorated into a stumbling, uneven gait, and she began repeating the same sentence to her climbing partner, unaware she'd already said it twice before. Pemba recognized the pattern immediately, cerebral edema, and past the point where a slow descent alone could save her. He radioed for emergency oxygen and began an immediate descent, half carrying her across the fixed ropes while the wind tried to pull them both off balance. Deborah died at 11:52 that morning, near 27,200 feet, less than 200 meters from the tent, where a rescue team was already climbing toward her. Witnesses said her last coherent words were a complaint that no one had warned her the descent would be this cold. An investigation by the expedition company later concluded that a properly seated oxygen mask and a single additional rest day at Camp 2 would likely have prevented the swelling that killed her. Her family sued the outfitter for $6 million. The case was dismissed within 4 months, and the outfitter released her medical records to prove every warning had been documented in writing. But Deborah's mistake was believing money could buy her way past a mountain that doesn't take bribes. The next climber's mistake was different, and in some ways far more disturbing. He'd learned that faking a crisis brought him attention, and he never once expected the mountain to hand him a real one. It was May 19, 2024. Everest Base Camp, 17,600 feet, temperature -6 degrees Fahrenheit. Prayer flags snapping hard in a wind that hadn't let up in 3 straight days. Tyler Brecht was 31 years old, a social media influencer from Miami, Florida, with 400,000 followers and a habit of turning every hardship into content. His flaw was simple and, in hindsight, fatal. He had faked altitude sickness twice already on previous expeditions, specifically to trigger dramatic helicopter rescues for his channel, and both times the stunt had worked perfectly. The first warning sign surfaced at base camp when the expedition doctor, a woman named Anissa Rahman, reviewed his medical history and found records of 2 prior insurance claims for emergency evacuations that didn't match his actual symptoms at the time. She flagged him privately as a liability risk and told the lead guide to monitor him closely from day 1. I need you to remember what I just told you, because it matters more than you think right now. This man had already lied twice before, and lies like that don't just disappear, they follow you up the mountain and wait. If you think you know how this ends, put your prediction in the comments right now before I tell you, because I promise most people get this one wrong. And hit subscribe if you want to see whether your gut instinct was right. The second warning sign came at Camp 2 when Tyler complained loudly of chest pain and demanded an immediate evacuation on camera, only for his oxygen saturation to read a healthy 89%, completely normal for that elevation. The guide, a New Zealander named Craig Ellison, refused the request outright and told him bluntly that fake emergencies wasted resources meant for people in genuine danger. The third warning sign happened at Camp 3, 23,500 feet, when Tyler again staged a coughing fit for his camera, describing textbook symptoms of high-altitude pulmonary edema to his followers in a breathless voiceover, while his actual vital signs stayed completely stable. Craig warned him directly this time, if he cried wolf one more time, the entire team would stop taking his complaints seriously, no matter what. The inciting incident began at 2:07 in the morning, on May 23, during the summit push above the South Col, when Tyler's breathing turned genuinely labored, a wet crackling sound audible even over the howling wind. He radioed down describing real chest tightness and told his guide he couldn't continue. Craig, remembering 3 prior false alarms, told him flatly to keep moving and stop performing for the camera. This is the part of the story people can't stop talking about, and I think you'll understand why in about 90 seconds. What happens when the truth finally arrives wearing the same costume as every lie before it? Tell me honestly in the comments if you think you'd have believed him either, because I'm not sure I would have. And if this question sits with you the way it sat with me, subscribing means you won't miss what this channel digs up next. By 3:50 that morning, Tyler was coughing up pink, frothy fluid, an unmistakable sign of high-altitude pulmonary edema, but his own history had trained his team to doubt every word out of his mouth. Another climber finally noticed his lips had turned a dusky blue and insisted the symptoms looked different this time, urgently different. Craig radioed base camp for an emergency descent, but confirmation and coordination cost nearly 40 critical minutes because Dr. Rahman initially assumed it was simply another staged episode for the cameras. Tyler died at 5:33 that morning at 25,900 feet, his lungs filling with fluid faster than the descent could outpace it. His final words, according to a nearby climber, were a quiet apology for not being believed sooner. The subsequent investigation confirmed acute HAPE with no evidence of fabrication this time, and noted plainly that the delayed response was a direct consequence of his own manufactured history. His management team released a statement blaming the expedition company entirely. The company responded by releasing Dr. Rahman's medical logs, and the criticism stopped within a week. 2 climbers who demanded the mountain bend to them, and 2 guides who watched entitlement curdle into tragedy in real time. Everest doesn't care about your bank account or your follower count, and it never has. Not once, not for anyone. If you want to see what happens when the next climber ignores that same lesson, subscribe to Mountain Takes right now, because this mountain has plenty more stories left to tell, and I promise you won't see the next one coming. It was 6:30 a.m. on April 18, 2014, in the Khumbu Icefall on Mount Everest. The Khumbu Icefall is the most dangerous section of the entire route to Everest summit, a constantly moving river of glacial ice that breaks apart, shifts, and collapses without warning. Seracs, massive blocks of ice hanging from the glacier, can fall at any moment. Crevasses open and close. The terrain is unstable by definition. Every year, Sherpa workers climbed through this icefall multiple times, fixing ropes, establishing routes, carrying loads that will eventually make their way to higher camps where paying clients will use them. The work is essential. The work is also deadly. On the morning of April 18th, a group of approximately 40 Sherpa porters and climbing guides were in the icefall, working on a section between Camp 1 and Camp 2. They were establishing the main route for the 2014 spring climbing season. This was early season work. The ropes had to be in place before the commercial expeditions could move clients higher. The work was routine in the sense that it happened every year, but routine does not mean safe. Routine only means that people had become accustomed to the danger. At approximately 6:30 a.m., a massive serac, an estimated block of ice weighing hundreds of tons, fractured at its base. The serac had been hanging above the route for weeks, holding in place by the pressure of the surrounding ice. But the constant movement of the glacier, the slight warming of spring, the imperceptible shifts in ice structure, something changed. The serac's foundation failed, and 300 tons of ice began to fall. The sound of a serac collapse at that scale is described by survivors as deafening a roar that seems to come from the mountain itself. But sound travels slower than falling ice. By the time the Sherpas heard the warning, the ice was already falling on them. The serac exploded into massive chunks the size of houses, fragments the size of cars, shrapnel the size of boulders. It fell on the exact section of the route where the 40 Sherpa workers were positioned. 16 Sherpas were killed in the collapse, a detail that itself speaks to the invisibility of Sherpa workers in the Western mountaineering narrative. The survivors descended immediately, moving as fast as the terrain allowed, carrying news of the disaster down the mountain. By midday, the information had reached base camp. By evening, it had reached the world. Media outlets reported avalanche on Everest, 16 dead, but most media outlets were imprecise about what had actually happened. They called it an avalanche. It was a serac collapse, a different hazard, with different implications about responsibility and prevention. What makes the 2014 Khumbu icefall collapse significant is not just the death toll. Though 16 deaths in a single incident was the deadliest moment in Sherpa mountaineering history, what makes it significant is what it revealed about the system that had been in place for decades without serious challenge. The Sherpas who died were paid between $400 and $600 per season to do the most dangerous work on the mountain. Their life insurance was minimal. Their safety equipment was basic. The routes they were establishing were chosen by expedition companies to optimize client flow, not Sherpa safety. When a serac fell, there was no way to predict it. There was no way to prevent it. There was only the reality that young men from rural Nepal were doing extraordinarily dangerous work for poverty wages so that wealthy climbers from around the world could attempt to reach a summit. The names of the dead Sherpas circulated through the climbing community, but rarely made it into mainstream Western news. The names of the clients on the mountain that year, the wealthy, businessmen and celebrities who had paid $45, their stories were told, their achievements were documented. But the names of the Sherpas who fixed the ropes for them, who carried their loads, who died doing that work, remained largely anonymous. One of the survivors, a Sherpa named Ang Shering, gave a statement that captured the systemic nature of the problem. "We Sherpas risk our lives every day on this mountain. We have families depending on us, but nobody cares about our safety until people die, and then nobody remembers our names." His words, documented by journalists covering the disaster, pointed to a reality that the climbing community had largely ignored. The mountain's danger does not discriminate between Sherpa and client, but the mountain's rewards certainly do. The response in the climbing community was significant but limited. Some expedition companies announced they would increase Sherpa wages. Some pledged to improve safety protocols. Some announced that they would not attempt Everest that season out of respect for the dead. But most of the commercial expeditions continued. The clients had paid their fees. The mountain had taken its toll, and the system continued almost unchanged. What happened after April 18, 2014, was that the names of the dead Sherpas slowly faded from public consciousness. News cycles moved on. The documentary makers captured footage of grieving families in Sherpa villages. But those documentaries were rarely watched by the mainstream audience. The climbing industry continued. Everest continued to be climbed. New Sherpa workers were recruited. They climbed the same icefall. They took the same risks. They earned the same poverty wages. The investigation into the 2014 collapse determined that the Serek had been inherently unstable for some time and that there was no practical way to have predicted its collapse. This was technically true, but it also meant that the system which had placed workers in that exact location every single year was fundamentally flawed. A system that places human beings in front of hazards that cannot be predicted or prevented is not a system with acceptable risk. It is a system that has decided the risk to other people's lives is acceptable. If you've ever wondered who pays the real price for climbing mountains, if you've ever questioned what it means that the most dangerous work is done by the poorest workers for the lowest wages, subscribe, because there are more stories of the people the mountains take who never get to be famous. Their names matter too. I'll see you on the next descent. It was a clear morning on June 21, 2025, at Gitchen Mountain in the Valais region of the Swiss Alps, a peak that sits at 3,823 meters and has become a popular launch point for base jumpers because of its steep walls and reliable wind patterns. Liam Byrne was there with two other wingsuit base jumpers, part of a small crew filming content for a sponsorship deal with a major outdoor apparel brand. The forecast was perfect: clear skies, moderate winds, the kind of conditions that make jumps feel routine rather than dangerous. Liam had been awake since 5 a.m., mentally preparing. He'd done this 4,000 times before. His body knew the sequence. His mind had automated the decision-making. He was on autopilot in the way that expertise creates a dangerous kind of confidence, where the body executes so flawlessly that the brain stops perceiving risk. His parents first brought him to the mountains at age 5, casual hiking trips to the Lake District. By 12, he was climbing mountains seriously. Kilimanjaro was his first major summit. His father, a former RAF pilot, introduced him to skydiving at 16. By 19, Liam was a certified skydiving instructor. The progression had been meteoric and deliberate: mountains, skydiving, wingsuit base jumping, each discipline built on the previous one, each one more dangerous, each one more compelling. He'd accumulated 4,000 wingsuit base jumps across 7 years. He'd been featured in the BBC documentary The Boy Who Can Fly in 2024, a film that had introduced him to audiences far beyond the base jumping community. He had 187,000 Instagram followers. Every jump was documented. Every landing was analyzed by thousands of people online. The sponsorship deal that brought him to Gitchen Mountain, a major outdoor brand, wanted content of wingsuit base jumps in iconic European locations. Gitchen qualified. The content requirements were specific: sunrise jumps, aerial footage from a drone, landing sequences. Liam and his crew had been filming for 3 days. This was meant to be the final sequence, the money shot, the one that would anchor the entire campaign. Liam had already completed 2 successful jumps that morning without incident. The crew was rotating through final equipment checks. Weather window was holding. Everything was aligned. What the crew didn't discuss, but what every experienced base jumper knows, is that repetition creates a particular type of danger. The jump feels identical to the 50th jump. The body executes so automatically that the mind stops doing the micro-assessments that keep jumpers alive. Liam's team lead, a 31-year-old base jumping instructor named Marcus Webb, would later tell investigators that he'd noticed Liam seemed relaxed that morning. Not in a good way, in a way that suggested the risk had become invisible. At 9:47 a.m., Liam performed his final equipment check. Helmet secured, wingsuit straps tightened, main parachute reserve on his back, secondary deployment system functioning. Everything identical to the 4,000 previous checks. At 10:03 a.m., he moved to the jump platform at the cliff edge, a natural outcropping that base jumpers had used for years. Marcus was filming with a handheld camera. Another jumper, Sophie Chen, 26, was standing 20 meters away preparing for her own jump sequence. The drone was already airborne, capturing the mountain landscape. Liam stood at the edge, did his final mental walkthrough, and jumped. The first 15 seconds of a wingsuit base jump are the most critical. The jumper has fallen perhaps 300 feet, reached terminal velocity around 120 miles per hour, and the parachute has not yet deployed. The wingsuit is providing horizontal glide that can extend the jump significantly. At 15 seconds into Liam's jump, at an altitude of approximately 3,200 meters and horizontal distance of roughly 400 meters from the cliff, something went wrong. What witnesses could see from the ground was that Liam's body position suddenly became unstable. His wingsuit, which should have been maintaining a controlled horizontal glide, suddenly pitched downward. Sophie, who was watching from the cliff, described it as his body went inverted. His heading changed from away from the mountain toward the mountain. The drone camera, still recording, captured the moment though. The footage was too brief and distant to determine mechanical failure versus human error. Liam's reserve parachute system should have deployed automatically at this point. Modern wingsuit-based systems include altitude-activated devices that deploy parachutes if the jumper falls below a certain altitude without manually deploying. But those systems only function if the jumper is in a position to deploy them successfully, if the body is tumbling, if the orientation is wrong, if the descent rate is too high. Deployment can fail. Marcus later reported that he heard Liam's reserve parachute deploy. "I heard it," Marcus told investigators. "The sound of the parachute opening. Then nothing." The footage from the drone showed the parachute deploying, but something was already wrong with Liam's trajectory. The parachute opened in a partial configuration, tangled with his wingsuit fabric. A parachute that deploys while the jumper is in an inverted or tumbling position can create worse aerodynamics than no parachute at all. By the time Sophie realized something had gone critically wrong, Liam had already fallen below the rescue threshold. He impacted the mountainside near a rocky outcrop at approximately 2,900 meters. The impact injuries were catastrophic and immediately fatal. He was 24 years old. He had completed exactly 4,000 successful wingsuit base jumps. The recovery operation took 6 hours. Mountain rescue teams from the canton of Valais responded. Liam's body was recovered intact, but with injuries incompatible with survival. The investigation that followed examined equipment failure versus pilot error. The reserve parachute system functioned correctly. The activation was confirmed by the mechanical record. The wingsuit was intact with no manufacturing defects. The helmet camera footage from Liam's helmet was corrupted by the impact and provided no data. The drone footage showed the beginning of the incident, but not the causation. The final investigation report from the Swiss Mountaineering Authority concluded apparent loss of body position control during initial descent phase, leading to unstable configuration, unsuitable for parachute deployment. Contributing factors may include high jump frequency, minimal rest intervals between jumps on the day in question, and possible altitude-related decision-making degradation. Pilot error cannot be excluded. Equipment failure cannot be confirmed. Sophie Chen didn't jump again for 2 months. Marcus Webb retired from active base jumping the following day. Liam's parents requested privacy. The BBC released a statement honoring his memory. His Instagram account, still with 187,000 followers, became a digital memorial. The final photo he posted was from the cliff at Gitchen Mountain that morning, taken at 9:15 a.m., 48 minutes before the fatal jump. The caption read, "Perfect day, perfect conditions, let's fly. I'm Isaac from the Mountain Takes." Liam Byrne was 24 years old. He was better at wingsuit-based jumping than almost anyone alive, and he still died doing it. If you've ever gotten so comfortable with something dangerous that the danger becomes invisible, if you've ever confused experience with invincibility, subscribe, because there are more stories of people the mountains take, not because they were incompetent, but because expertise sometimes blinds us to the moments when expertise isn't enough. I'll see you on the next descent. It was April 30th, 2017, on Mount Annapurna in Nepal. The temperature at 7,000 meters was minus 35 degrees Celsius. The wind was moderate. The visibility was clear. Ueli Steck, 40 years old, a Swiss alpinist, was attempting a solo speed climb of Annapurna's south face, one of the most difficult and dangerous routes on one of the deadliest mountains on Earth. He had left advanced base camp early that morning with a small pack containing minimal gear. His plan was to climb fast, climb alone, and set a new speed record for the south face. He had done similar solo speed climbs before. He had broken speed records on other mountains. He was one of the world's most accomplished alpinists. And on April 30th, 2017, he went onto Annapurna and never came back down alive. Ueli Steck was born on December 4, 1976, in Switzerland. From childhood, he had been drawn to mountains. By his teenage years, he was climbing serious alpine terrain. By his 20s, he was soloing some of the most difficult mountains in the Alps. By his 30s, he had begun attempting the world's highest peaks, not with large expeditions and support teams, but alone, moving fast, pushing the limits of what seemed possible. In high-altitude mountaineering, he had made the first solo ascent of the north face of the Eiger in winter. He had soloed Denali. He had broken speed records on multiple 8,000ers. His reputation in the climbing world was almost mythical, a man who moved through mountains with a grace and efficiency that made the impossible look routine. But Ueli also had a reputation for conflict. He was opinionated. He was dismissive of commercial climbing operations that, in his view, treated mountains like tourist attractions. He had clashed with other climbers. He had made enemies. And in the weeks before his death on Annapurna, there had been tensions at base camp between his team and local Sherpa workers. The exact nature of these tensions was never fully documented in public records, but multiple sources reported that there had been arguments, that Ueli had been frustrated with the pace of operations, that there had been confrontations. On April 30th, 2017, Ueli left Advanced Base Camp at approximately 4 a.m. He was moving solo. He had a radio. His plan was to communicate with his team periodically as he climbed higher. His goal was to reach the summit and return to Advanced Base Camp within approximately 24 hours, an extraordinarily aggressive timeline for Annapurna's south face, which is one of the most technically demanding and dangerous routes on the mountain. The morning progressed. Ueli moved up the route. He communicated with base camp at several checkpoints. His progress was faster than anticipated. He was performing at the level of skill that had made him legendary, moving efficiently, making good time, pushing toward the summit with a focus and determination that seemed almost superhuman. Base camp tracked his progress. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. At approximately 2 p.m. on April 30th, Ueli was at approximately 7,000 meters on the south face. He was ahead of schedule. He was moving well. He radioed base camp and reported his position. Base camp gave him a weather update. The forecast was good. The window was holding. Everything was aligned for a successful push toward the summit. And then the communication stopped. Base camp tried to reach Ueli on the radio. No response. They tried again. Still nothing. Hours passed. Ueli did not respond to any radio calls. Base camp waited, thinking perhaps his radio had died, perhaps the batteries had failed, perhaps he was in a section of the mountain where radio signals couldn't reach. But as hours turned into a full day with no communication, the reality became clear. Something had gone wrong. On May 1st, a rescue operation began. Sherpa guides and other climbers from base camp began moving up the route to search for Ueli. The weather was deteriorating. The window that had been so promising was closing. The rescue effort was dangerous. They were moving up a mountain in worsening conditions, searching for a climber who had simply vanished. On May 2nd, Ueli's body was found. At approximately 6,500 meters on the south face, he was deceased. The exact cause of death became the subject of immediate and intense debate that would continue for years. The official investigation concluded that Ueli had fallen. The terrain where he was found suggested a fall. His body was positioned as if it had impacted rock during a descent. The injuries he sustained were consistent with a major fall. The logical conclusion was that Ueli had slipped, had fallen, and had died from impact. Injuries. This was the story told by the official rescue report. But there were complications to this narrative. Some of the Sherpa guides who found Ueli reported seeing evidence that seemed inconsistent with a simple fall. There were reports of possible confrontation marks on Ueli's body that some interpreted as evidence of violence. There were rumors, never substantiated, that there had been a physical altercation between Ueli and Sherpa workers from a rival expedition team in the days before his death. There were suggestions that the fall might not have been accidental. The investigation examined these claims. The official conclusion remained: Ueli fell. But the presence of conflicting accounts, the tensions that existed at base camp, and the unusual circumstances of his death created a narrative that extended beyond simple accident. There were people who believed Ueli had been murdered. There were people who believed the official investigation was incomplete. There were people who believed the truth of what happened on Annapurna's south face on April 30th, 2017, would never be fully known. What is documented is that Ueli Steck, one of the world's greatest alpinists, died on a mountain he was attempting to conquer. What is unclear is exactly how he died, whether it was a fall caused by exhaustion, altitude, or terrain hazard. Whether it was something else entirely, the mountain kept that secret. Ueli's death sent shockwaves through the climbing community. Here was a man, at the absolute peak of his abilities, attempting one of the world's most difficult climbs, dying under circumstances that were never fully explained. His family mourned, the climbing world mourned, and the questions about what actually happened remained unanswered. If you've ever wondered what happens when ambition meets mountains at their deadliest, if you've ever questioned whether the best climbers are truly untouchable, subscribe, because there are more stories of mountains that solve mysteries by keeping them. It was April 17, 2023, at approximately 8:30 a.m. in the morning at Camp 4 on Mount Annapurna, sitting at 23,300 feet on the south side of the mountain. The temperature was -32 degrees Celsius. The wind was steady but not extreme. The weather was actually stable, clear skies, good visibility, the kind of conditions that make mountaineers feel secure. A climber lay in his tent, having returned from the summit the previous day. He had eaten hot soup the evening before. He had fallen asleep, and now, in the morning, he was not waking up. His tentmates found him in the night unconscious, breathing shallow, no response to stimuli. By morning, there was no response at all. He was gone. His name was Noel Hannah, and he was 56 years old. Noel Hannah was born in Northern Ireland in 1966 and had become one of his country's most accomplished mountaineers. His climbing resume was extraordinary. He had summited Mount Everest on 10 separate occasions, more summits than most climbers will ever attempt. In 2018, at age 52, he became the first person from the island of Ireland north and south combined to summit K2 and descend alive. K2 is known as the Savage Mountain, second highest peak on Earth, and a mountain where the fatality rate approaches 10%. To summit K2 and come back down alive is an achievement that separates elite mountaineers from everyone else attempting high-altitude peaks. He had done it. For over 30 years, Noel Hannah had dedicated his life to mountains. He wasn't a sponsored climber chasing social media followers. He wasn't a wealthy businessman checking items off a luxury list. He was a mountaineer in the traditional sense, a man who understood mountains in his bones, who respected their power, who had survived them repeatedly because he treated them with the reverence they demanded. The Irish climbing community knew his name. Fellow guides knew his name. People in the mountaineering world knew that Noel Hannah was a legitimate, accomplished, experienced high-altitude climber. On April 15, 2023, he summited Annapurna without supplemental oxygen. This was significant climbing at 26,545 feet without bottled oxygen is a different order of difficulty than climbing with oxygen support. His body had to process the extreme altitude on its own resources. He reached the summit and began his descent. He moved carefully down the mountain, conserving energy, following the fixed ropes, doing everything right. He made it back to Camp 4 at 23,300 feet. He was alive. He had achieved his goal. He had successfully summited and descended one of the world's deadliest mountains. That evening, April 15th, he ate hot soup in his tent. The expedition team noted that he seemed fine. He was tired, as any climber would be after a summit push and descent, but he was functional, coherent, responsive. He said he was going to sleep. His tentmates said goodnight, and Noel Hannah lay down to sleep at 23,300 feet on Annapurna, having successfully summited, having safely descended, having done everything a mountaineer is supposed to do. During the night, something changed. At extreme altitude, the human body exists in a state of constant physiological compromise. Every system is running on reserve. The heart is working overtime. The lungs are struggling to extract oxygen from air that contains 1/3 the oxygen of sea level. The brain is slowly being starved. For most climbers, this compromise is temporary. They summit and descend quickly to lower altitude where the body can begin to recover. But sometimes at 23,300 feet in the middle of the night, a body that has performed flawlessly all day simply decides to stop. A heart that has beaten millions of times at altitude suddenly skips a beat it cannot recover from. Respiratory function that has been maintained through sheer physiological determination simply ceases. By the time Noel Hannah's tentmates realized something was wrong, he was already unconscious. His breathing was shallow, his pupils were fixed. Medical intervention at that altitude in those conditions with those resources is essentially impossible. There is no emergency room at 23,300 feet. There is no defibrillator that will restart a heart at the edge of the death zone. There is only the reality that the body has failed and the mountain will collect its payment. Noel Hannah died at Camp 4 on Annapurna on April 17, 2023. The exact cause was never definitively determined, and at that altitude, with those conditions, the exact cause doesn't really matter. It was altitude, it was exposure, it was a body that had given everything it had to give and had nothing left. It was the mountain operating according to its indifferent mathematics. His wife, Lynn Hannah, posted on Facebook after his death. He returned to the tent, took some hot soup, and fell asleep, never to awaken again. No drama. No big story. It was his time to go, and he died in the Himalayas. What better place for my mountain man? Sleep well, Noel. Those words, "it was his time to go," contain a kind of acceptance that most of us will never have to make. Noel Hannah had spent 30 years in mountains, knowing that this was a possibility. He had summited Everest 10 times. He had climbed dozens of peaks across the Himalayas and Karakoram. He had looked at mountains, and mountains had looked back at him, and when his time came, it came peacefully, not in a dramatic fall, not in an avalanche, not in a blizzard. It came in his sleep, after a successful day, at a place he loved, doing exactly what he had chosen to do his entire life. I'm Isaac from The Mountain Takes. If you've ever wondered what it means to spend your entire life in pursuit of mountains, if you've ever asked yourself whether a life dedicated to altitude and ice and risk is worth the cost, this is the story to sit with. Noel Hannah spent 30 years in mountains, and the mountains let him die on his own terms peacefully, after success, in the place he belonged. Some people search their entire lives for that kind of ending. He found it at 23,300 feet. Subscribe, because there are more stories of people who gave everything to mountains and what those mountains took in return. I'll see you on the next descent.